Dorothea Kilbride was 41 years old, and she had nothing left in the world but $9, a wool coat with a torn hem, and a grief she carried the way other women carried water buckets. Balanced, careful, never set down for long. It was the bank that had done it, or rather the man who ran the bank, Elias Vane, who stood on her porch in the gray hush of a Minnesota December and told her that grief was not collateral, that a widow with no sons to work the land and no husband to sign the note was, in his words, a poor risk the bank could no longer carry. He took the farm her husband Amos had cleared stone by stone. He took the barn. He left her the $9 from selling her wedding china to a peddler, and not a cent more. With that $9, Dorothea did something the whole town of Frost Hollow would call foolish, and some would call it worse than foolish. She paid $7 at a forgotten corner of a bank auction for a collapsing, frost-split ice house on the edge of Willow Lake, a structure so old and so useless that even the auctioneer laughed before he took her money. But sealed beneath the sawdust and the black ice of that condemned building was something that would not only save Dorothea Kilbride. It would return to an entire town what had been quietly stolen from it a generation before. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Dorothea Kilbride. If you're watching from a place that feels forgotten, the way an old ice house can feel forgotten at the edge of frozen lake, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Dorothea had not always been a woman with $9 to her name. She had been raised on the eastern shore of that very lake, in a clapboard house that smelled of wood smoke and rendered tallow, the second daughter of a cooper named Henrik Solberg, a broad, quiet Norwegian who built barrels for the ice trade and taught his daughters, against the custom of the county, that a woman's hands were worth exactly as much as a man's if she was willing to use them. Dorothea grew up watching the ice harvest each January, when the men of Frost Hollow walked out onto Willow Lake with horse-drawn saws and cut great blue-white blocks from the frozen surface, hauling them by sledge to the ice houses that lined the shore, packing them in sawdust so they would last clear through the following summer and be sold as far south as St. Paul. It was hard, precise, dangerous work, and her father had taught her to read the ice the way other men read Scripture, to know by its color and its ring under a mallet whether it was safe to walk on, whether it would bear the weight of a horse or only a girl. She learned, too, his quieter lesson, the one he repeated so often it became a kind of family prayer, that nothing was ever truly worthless, only unlooked at, and that a discarded thing often held more value than the shining thing beside it, if a person had the patience to look twice. She married Amos Kilbride when she was 22, a gentle, sturdy young farmer with sunburned forearms and a laugh that came easily. And together they took a parcel of land 3 miles west of the lake and built a life the way her father had built barrels, plank by plank, with care expecting it to hold. They had no children who lived past infancy. A sorrowed Dorothea folded quietly into herself and never spoke of unless someone else spoke first. But they had each other, and they had 13 years of mornings spent side by side in the frost-heavy fields, and Dorothea learned to keep books, to doctor a sick calf, to mend harness leather, to stretch a dollar until it nearly wept. She was, by the account of everyone in Frost Hollow, a woman of uncommon capability, the kind neighbors sent for when a fever ran high or a foal came breech, and she wore that reputation the way she wore her plain gray dresses, without vanity, simply because it was useful and it was true. Then came the winter Amos took a chill that would not break, a winter that bled into a spring he did not live to see, and Dorothea buried her husband in the frozen churchyard with the same hands that had once braided her wedding wreath. She kept the farm alone for 2 more years, working it as hard as any 2 men might have. But the note Amos had signed years before with the Frost Hollow Savings Bank came due at the worst possible season, when a hailstorm had flattened her wheat and a fever had taken half her hens, and Elias Vane, who had inherited both the bank and his father's particular coldness, decided that a widow's promise was not worth the paper it was written on. He foreclosed in December, with what Dorothea would later describe, when she finally spoke of it, as a patience that felt almost cruel. He waited until the ground was frozen too hard for her to dig in a garden that might have fed her, until the roads were too deep in snow for her to easily seek work elsewhere, and only then did he send the sheriff with the papers. It was in the wreckage of that loss, standing in a yard of the farm that no longer belonged to her, watching a stranger's wagon haul away the milk cow she had raised from a calf, that Dorothea first heard about the auction. The bank, cleaning out a list of old, forfeited, and forgotten properties from decades past, had scheduled a public sale for the following week, a sale so unimportant that it was held not in the courthouse, but on the frozen boardwalk outside the bank itself, in the bitter open air, as though the town wanted to be done with the whole business as quickly as possible. Among the parcels listed, mostly weed-choked lots and one collapsed grain silo nobody wanted, was a single line that caught Dorothea's eye only because she recognized the location. An old ice house on the north shore of Willow Lake, condemned, structurally unsound, sold as is, no warranty of title beyond quitclaim. It had belonged, decades before, to a freedman named Solomon Reeve, who had built and run an independent ice-cutting operation on that shore before Dorothea was even born, and who had vanished from local memory so thoroughly that most young people in Frost Hollow did not know his name at all. On the day of the auction, Dorothea stood at the back of a small, shivering crowd with her $9 folded inside her glove, watching men bid half-heartedly on parcels of land they intended to strip for lumber or simply hold until spring. When the auctioneer read out the Icehouse, chuckling as he did, calling it $7 worth of rotten boards and bad memories, if anyone's fool enough, no one raised a hand. Dorothea raised hers. There was laughter, not unkind exactly, but the particular laughter reserved for a woman who has clearly lost more than her farm, who has perhaps lost some portion of her sense as well. Elias Vane himself, standing near the bank's door in his Goodwill coat, looked at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, an expression of pity so thin it was nearly contempt, and said, loud enough for the crowd to hear, that she was welcome to it, that the bank had been trying to be rid of that eyesore for 20 years, and he wished her joy of it. Dorothea paid her $7 in coin, took the folded paper that named her, absurdly, the sole owner of a condemned ice house on Willow Lake, and walked the 3 frozen miles to see what she had bought, because she did not have the 2 cents for the trolley, and because some stubborn, inherited part of her, her father's part, refused to let the town's laughter be the last word. The ice house, when she reached it in the fading blue light of that winter afternoon, was worse than she had feared and somehow, in a way she could not name, better than she had hoped. Half its roof had caved under some old snowfall, and its north wall leaned like a tired old man, and the door hung from a single hinge, groaning when the wind pushed it. But it stood on the same shore where she had learned to read ice as a girl, and something in her, call it memory, call it her father's old teaching about unlooked-at things, made her push inside instead of turning back toward town and whatever cold charity awaited her there. Inside, the ice house smelled of old sawdust and colder things of decades of frozen silence, and Dorothea found that despite the collapsed roof, the deep pit where ice had once been stored still held its old blocks, gray and ancient and packed thick in sawdust that had never fully melted even through all those forgotten summers, insulated by the very structure that had failed above them. It was, she realized with a strange lift of feeling in her chest, still functioning as an ice house should, however badly, the deep-set pit keeping its contents cold and dark and undisturbed. She had nowhere else to sleep that night, no coin for a room, and so, with the practical courage that had carried her through 13 years of farm life and 2 years of widowhood, she cleared a corner of the antechamber near the door, away from the ice pit itself, and made a hard, cold bed of old sawdust and her own coat, and told herself that in the morning she would think about what to do with $7 worth of ruin. It was on that first night, restless and unable to sleep, that Dorothea took a lantern she had found hanging by the door, rusted but still holding a stub of candle, and walked the perimeter of the ice house to judge how much of it might be saved. She noticed, near the base of the leaning north wall, that the old sawdust had been disturbed in a way that did not match the settled, undisturbed dust everywhere else, a shallow depression as though something had been dug out and covered over many years before, so long ago that a fine crust of dust had reformed above it. She might have thought nothing of it. Ice houses settled and shifted with frost heave every winter, Except that beneath that depression, when she knelt and brushed the sawdust away with her cold fingers, she found not earth but wood. A trapdoor, iron-ringed, built into the floor of the ice house itself, hidden below the sawdust the way a root cellar might be hidden below a barn floor. It took her the better part of an hour, working by candlelight with hands numb from cold, to clear enough sawdust to free the ring. And when she finally pulled the door open, the hinges shrieking in protest after who knew how many years of silence, she found not the frozen dirt she expected, but a narrow set of plank stairs leading down into a small stone-lined chamber, dry and cold and untouched, built with a mason's care beneath the ice pit where no casual visitor would ever think to look. What Dorothea found in that chamber, over the course of the following days, would change not only her own life, but the fortunes of nearly every family in Frost Hollow whose roots ran back to the ice trade. Wrapped in oiled canvas and packed in a cedar chest gone soft with age, she found first a leather-bound ledger, its pages brittle but legible, written in a careful, looping hand that recorded years of ice sold, wages paid, and debts owed. The business records of Solomon Reeves' ice-cutting cooperative, which she came to understand, as she read deeper by candlelight over the following nights, had once employed nearly a dozen local families, black and white and Norwegian alike, on shares rather than wages, an arrangement almost unheard of in that place and time. Beneath the ledger lay a second document that made Dorothea's breath catch in the cold chamber air, an original deed, notarized and witnessed, showing that Solomon Reeve had purchased the entire North Shore parcel outright in 1858, nearly 30 years before, with funds pooled from the cooperative itself, meaning the ice-cutting rights and the shoreline had never truly belonged to the bank at all, but had been seized through a foreclosure Dorothea slowly came to realize, reading the surrounding papers, had been built on a forged default notice, backdated and filed by a bank officer whose signature she recognized with a cold shock. Because she had seen that same looping hand on foreclosure papers of her own, it belonged to Josiah Vane, Elias Vane's father, founder of the Frost Hollow Savings Bank. The full shape of what had happened emerged slowly, the way ice forms on still water, one clear layer at a time. Solomon Reeve, it seemed, had built something rare and threatening in the eyes of a small, ambitious banker, a thriving, independent enterprise owned by a black freedman that employed poor families of every background on fair shares rather than debt, cutting into the profits Josiah Vane wanted for his own competing ice operation. Rather than compete honestly, Josiah had used his position at the bank to forge a default on a small operating loan Reeve had never actually missed a payment on, foreclosed swiftly and quietly in the dead of a hard winter when Reeve had no means to travel to the county seat and contest it, and seized the land and the ice house under color of law before anyone could object. Solomon Reeve, according to a final, aching letter Dorothea found folded at the bottom of the chest, addressed to no one and perhaps never sent, had tried for 2 years to fight the seizure through the courts, had been turned away and delayed, and quietly threatened, and had finally left Frost Hollow altogether rather than watch his life's work sold off piece by piece to men who had never earned it. But not before he had hidden away, beneath the very ice pit that had been his pride, the proof of what was rightfully his and rightfully his workers, in the hope, the letter said, that someday, somehow, an honest hand might find it and set the scale right again. Dorothea sat for a long while in that cold stone chamber with the letter in her lap, and she found she was weeping, not only for Solomon Reeve, a man she had never met, but for herself, for Amos, for every family in Frost Hollow who had been quietly ground down by the same institution and, she now understood, very likely the same family's hand. She thought of her father's old teaching, that nothing was ever truly worthless, only unlooked at, and she understood for the first time how much larger that lesson had been than barrel staves and frozen lake ice. But understanding what she had found was only the beginning of Dorothea's trouble, because a widow with a quitclaim deed to a condemned ice house had no easy way to make a 40-year-old forgery matter to anyone with power to do something about it. She spent the following weeks carefully, cautiously, gathering what corroboration she could, visiting the county recorder's office in the next town over, where an elderly clerk named Mr. Pemberton, who remembered Solomon Reeve from his own boyhood, confirmed that there had indeed been a regular talk at the time about the foreclosure, though nothing had ever come of it. And finding, through careful questions at the general store and the Lutheran church, 3 surviving members of families who had worked the old Reeve cooperative as young people. A Norwegian farmer named Ingrid Halvorsen, now elderly, whose father had cut ice for Reeve, and 2 brothers, sons of a freedman named Amos Carter, no relation to Dorothea's late husband, though the coincidence of the name struck her as tender rather than strange, whose own father had likewise worked those shares and had spoken of the fair wages Solomon Reeve had paid him even on his deathbed, decades later, as the proudest work of his life. Word of Dorothea's discovery could not stay quiet for long in a town the size of Frost Hollow, and when it reached Elias Vane, he did not respond the way Dorothea had hoped a reasonable man might. He came to the Icehouse himself, on a raw morning in February, with 2 of his bank's clerks in tow, and stood at the shattered doorway telling Dorothea, in a voice gone hard and careful, that whatever old papers she believed she had found were the property of the bank, since they had been discovered on bank auction land, and that she would be wise to hand them over quietly before she found herself accused of theft, or worse, of tampering with a public sale. He reminded her, not gently, that she was a woman alone with no standing in the county, no money for a lawyer, and no friends left with influence enough to help her, and that the Vane family had built half of Frost Hollow and could, if pressed, unbuild whatever little standing she had left. It was, Dorothea would say much later, the closest she ever came to despair. Not the loss of her farm, which had at least been an honest, ordinary cruelty of debt and weather, but this, the raw threat of a man trying to bury his second theft on top of the first. She did not hand the papers over. Instead, working quietly through the cold weeks that followed, Dorothea did the one thing her years of keeping books and reading contracts had prepared her to do. She made copies, in her own careful hand, of the ledger and the deed and the letter, and she sent them, along with a plain, respectful account of what she had found, to a county judge in the seat town whom Mr. Pemberton the clerk vouched for as an honest man untouched by Vane's influence. And she asked, not for money, not for the land for herself, but for a proper hearing. She also did something that surprised even her as she was doing it. She went one by one to the families whose names appeared in Solomon Reeve's old ledger, the Halvorsens and the Carters, and 6 others besides, and told them plainly what she had found and what it might mean for them, because she had decided, sitting alone in that stone chamber with Reeve's unsent letter, that whatever came of this discovery, it could not belong to her alone. It had never been given to her to keep. It had been given to her, she believed, to return. The hearing, when it finally came in the last raw days of March, drew a larger crowd than Frost Hollow had seen in years, filling the small courtroom with farmers and shopkeepers and the sons and daughters of the old ice cooperative, all of them come to hear whether the county would recognize what Dorothea Kilbride, a woman most of them had last seen laughed off a public auction block, had found beneath $7 worth of rotten boards. Elias Vane came with his own lawyer, a sharp, city-trained man who argued that whatever papers Dorothea presented were unverifiable, decades old, possibly forged themselves, and irrelevant to present-day ownership regardless of what had or had not happened in 1858. But Dorothea had come prepared in the plain. Thorough way her father had taught her to prepare barrels for a hard winter. She had Mr. Pemberton's testimony as to the irregular filing at the time. She had Ingrid Halvorsen and the Carter brothers ready to speak, trembling but resolute, of what their fathers had told them about Solomon Reeve's fair dealing and the sudden, unexplained collapse of his cooperative. And she had, most damning of all, a second document she had found tucked in the chest's false bottom on a final, careful search the night before the hearing. A personal letter from Josiah Vane to a business partner, boastful and unguarded in the way private letters often are, all but admitting in plain, unwitting language that the Reeve default notice had been arranged to clear the North Shore for the bank's own ice concern. It was not, the judge noted dryly, the sort of letter an honest man tended to write, nor the sort of letter that would have survived if Josiah Vane had ever known where his old rival had hidden his proof. The judge's ruling did not come quickly, and it did not give Elias Vane the swift, humiliating public defeat that some in the crowd hungered for, because Dorothea herself had asked, quietly, that it not. What it gave, over the slow course of the following months, was something Dorothea judged more lasting. A formal finding that the original 1858 foreclosure had been fraudulent, an order restoring clear title of the North Shore parcel to Solomon Reeves' lawful heirs, located, after careful searching, in a nephew and two great-nieces living in St. Paul, who, upon hearing the whole strange story, chose not to reclaim the land for themselves, but to establish it, with Dorothea's blessing and help, as a cooperative ice and lumber concern open to any Frost Hollow family willing to work it on fair shares, precisely as Solomon Reeve had first intended it. Elias Vane, for his part, faced no prison sentence and no public ruin, but something in Frost Hollow that mattered nearly as much: the quiet, permanent erosion of the trust his family's name had traded on for 2 generations, as farmers who had once brought him their notes without question began instead to walk the extra mile to the new cooperative bank the Reeve heirs helped establish, and the Frost Hollow Savings Bank, starved of the confidence it had built on old sins, shrank year by year, until Elias Vane himself sold his interest and left the county entirely, a departure so quiet it barely made the newspaper, which Dorothea always felt was its own kind of justice. Not the loud, satisfying kind found in stories, but the slow, honest kind that simply lets a hollow thing collapse under its own weight. As for the Icehouse itself, Dorothea kept her $7 claim to it, and though the Reeve heirs offered her a share of the restored cooperative many times over, she asked only for a fair wage as its bookkeeper, a position she held for the rest of her working life, walking each morning down to the same shore where her father had once taught her to read ice, keeping the same careful ledgers that had once belonged to a man she had never met but had come, in a way, to know as well as family. The Icehouse's roof was rebuilt that summer by a dozen willing hands, Halvorsons and Carters and others besides, and the old stone chamber beneath the ice pit was left exactly as it was, sealed again, but this time marked, at Dorothea's quiet insistence, with a small bronze plate naming Solomon Reeve and the promise he had made in his letter, so that no one who came after would ever again call the place worthless. So we return, as we always do, to where we began, to a woman of 41 years, standing in the ruin of her old life with $9 in her glove, buying for 7 of them a broken-down ice house that the whole town of Frost Hollow had long since forgotten and gladly written off. It would have been easy, so easy, for Dorothea Kilbride to have walked past that auction, to have taken whatever cold charity was offered her, and disappeared quietly into the kind of forgotten widowhood the world reserves for women it has decided are no longer useful. But she remembered her father's teaching, that nothing is ever truly worthless, only unlooked at, and she carried that teaching down into a dark, cold chamber beneath the ice, and what she found there was not treasure in the way the word is usually meant, not gold, not riches for herself alone, but something rarer, proof that an old wrong could still be righted, if only someone was willing to look twice at what everyone else had already thrown away. Dorothea Kilbride did not set out to save a town. She set out only to survive a hard winter with $7 and a stubborn refusal to let injustice have a last word. And in doing so, she gave Frost Hollow back a piece of itself it hadn't even known it was missing. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Dorothea's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need a reminder that overlooked things and overlooked people often hold more worth than the world is willing to admit. We'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something or someone that others had already written off? Tell us below. We read every story you share. Until next time, stay close.